Let me also plug a couple of our upcoming events. For those of you who are members, you should have received an invitation to our annual gala, which is in 2 weeks on March 8th at the historic Dunbar Hotel in South Los Angeles on Central Avenue. We're going to have a very nice lunch. We have our awards presentations and a very good speaker lined up. And if you're not a member, you can find information on our website, lacityhistory.org, and it's there. The event is open to members and non-members. But we would like to encourage you to join the LA City Historical Society if you're not a member. Most of our activities are funded by our membership dues, so we do like to have you join as an actual member. And then we'll be back here in April 19th, for our next lecture. One of our board members, Geraldine Natz, will be speaking about her recent book on the development of the port in Los Angeles. And now I would like to if you have any questions about the organization, I'll be around after Michael's around. There may be a couple other board members showing up before we're done today, so just feel free to chat one of us up. But now I would like to introduce the chairman of the Marie Northrop Lecture Series, Michael Holland.
All right, well, thank you, everybody. Appreciate it when we have a nice crowd for one of these events in this beautiful facility. And of course, Russell goes out of his way to make us look and sound as good as possible. And so how we're going to do this is we are going to start with the documentary that Stephen G. Directed, wrote, produced, basically created on John Parkinson and his influence on the vision of Los Angeles and its architecture. And then once that is done, we will then have a conversation on the stage here for 45 minutes or so. Then we'll open it up for Q&A. So if you have any questions or if there are things that leap out at you, please feel free to participate. And then once we actually are finished here, we will actually be in the lobby where if you happen to have a copy of Stephen's book, or today only, I am told, the DVD of the documentary that we're going to be seeing is available at the bookstore. All these items are available at the bookstore and need to be purchased there. But you can go get them, bring them back here, and I'm sure Stephen won't be too embarrassed to sign them, right? Okay. All right. So that's going to be the format for today. And as Todd said, we do have our next one coming up on April 19th, which will be Geraldine Natz talking about the book that she is literally coming off the presses now, as I understand, on the development of the Port of Los Angeles. And so that'll be an interesting talk as well. Okay, so with no further ado, let's go ahead and as soon as Russell's ready, we'll drop the lights and we'll start the screening. Is your mic on?
I think so.
Excellent. Well, that was absolutely wonderful.
Thank you.
And, okay, passion project, of course. How long were you involved in getting the film made? I know that there's a lot of elements to getting something like that made when you're doing pretty much everything. So what was involved and how long did it take?
I think one of the crazy things, I look back at when we did the interview with Kevin Starr, and I think it was like 2010. And then the film came out in 2018, so like 8 years. So it basically dominated my life for about 10 years. It was something that was always kind of like ticking away in the background that I knew I could never feel settled until I finished this documentary, which primarily took so long because I think one of the things I enjoyed about watching it back was that there's so much archive footage of LA in it. And a lot of this footage was so expensive that I had to work a little bit, raise a bit of money, and sometimes you go to an archive and you say, do you have any footage of LA? And they'd show you the footage of LA, and you're like, oh boy, I want to use all of that. How much is it? And then they tell you, and and now I watch it and I'm kind of crying, thinking, oh, I remember how much that cost me, but hopefully it was worth it.
What first got you interested in John Parkinson?
Well, I guess for about 20 years I'd worked as a TV news producer, and we used to have the office I worked for, I guess most recently before I got interested in this, was in Burbank. And Burbank, is a wonderful place, but not a lot of stuff happens. And our office moved downtown, and just across the street into the U.S. Bank building. And I was like, boy, what a fabulous opportunity! You can live in LA and walk around. That wonderful dream that everybody has. And I started walking around and getting interested in all these historic buildings. And then I started doing a lot of different tours. And I did this one tour where this guy kept saying, and that's a Parkinson building, and that's a Parkinson building, and that's a Parkinson building. And all the way around the tour, it was like this. And I went home and I Googled John Parkinson, and it came up. John Parkinson was born in Scorton in Lancashire in England. And my father was from Lancashire in England. And I didn't grow up in Lancashire, but my dad did. And my dad's childhood was quite similar to John Parkinson's. They both grew up very poor. It wasn't a particularly pleasant environment. But if you asked either of them in later life, would they have chosen any other lifestyle or any other way of, but they wouldn't have done it. So for me, my dad's experience was always something I had a very romantic image of, even though it was very poor, and very bleak. He cherished it, and Parkinson cherished it. And then I couldn't believe that, the majority of iconic structures that I kind of connected to in the city were designed by this one guy that came from the same place as my dad. And one of the first things I did was I came into this building, and I went up to the architecture department, and I said, I want to check out all of your books on John Parkinson. And the woman looked at me and she said, like, who's that? And I thought, well, I'll make this would be a great documentary, So I applied for numerous grants, and I kept getting the same response, which is that we've never heard about him, and we've asked around amongst certain people in LA, and they'd never heard of him. We're not going to give you the money to make a film about somebody that's nobody's ever heard of, because nobody will ever want to watch it. So I faced this problem for years. And struggled, and finally got there. But one of the things that kind of came out of this, kind of almost by chance, is that literally one day I was sat in my office across the street, and I thought, well, how can you make somebody famous who's not famous, who deserves to be famous? And I literally sat there and I thought, oh, you know what, I've done so much research on this guy, I could write a book about him, somewhat stupidly. And this all happened in like a space of an hour. And I started surfing on the web and looking for different publishers that could publish a book about John Parkinson. And I found Angel City Press, and they said on their website, send us your proposal, or better still, send us a letter, and we'll get back to you in 2 to 4 months and let you know if we're interested. So I wrote this letter. I stuck it in the mail, 12 o'clock, in the mailbox just outside. I thought, I'll never hear from them ever again. I remember thinking that, sticking it in the envelope. I'll never hear from you ever again, but I'm going to try this and see what happens. So I stuck it in the mail. And then literally the next day at about 10 o'clock in the morning, I had no idea the post office worked this fast. But I get the call on the phone, and it was from the publisher at Angel City Press. He said, we got your letter, and we thought you were making it up. This guy had designed all of these buildings. Then we looked it up, and you're not making it up, and we'd like to see your proposal. And I'm like thinking, great, the publisher's called me. Oh no, I don't have a proposal. I've never even thought about a proposal. It says on your website 2 to 4 months. So I can't say this. I'm like, oh yeah, sure. I'll send it to you. I'll send it to you tomorrow. So I got off the phone. I'm like, oh no, what am I going to do? And then I realized I'd written so many failed grant proposals for this film that I sent them the narrative section for a National Endowment for the Humanities grant, which is enormous. And that ended up being the first chapter in a book I wrote about Parkinson. And then I got to write 2 other books because I'd written that book. But I had no intention of writing books. But because I so badly wanted to finish this film, it kind of led to a whole other aspect of my life that I never, ever would have anticipated otherwise.
So to put that back in context for a second, you send this proposal, yes, not a letter, not a proposal, but a letter to Angel City Press.
Right.
And that's in what year would you say that was?
2012.
2012.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's before you started work on the Central Library book. Yes.
Yeah.
And then the City Hall book after that. And so now you've finally written the book that you thought you were going to write first.
Well, no, the Parkinson book comes out in 2013.
It's been out already that long.
Yeah, it came out in 2013. I thought, I got to the end of that and I was like, that was a wonderful experience. I really enjoyed it, but I'm never doing it again. It was so much work, and it took over my life. And then the publisher said, well, there's a guy called Arnold Schwartzman, who was the graphic designer for the Olympics, graphic designer for the Queen, did all the Oscar posters, and he's got a grant to do a book on the Central Library. Would you do it? And it's like, how do you say no to that? So I did that book, and I got to the end of that, and I'm like, I'm never doing that again. It was a wonderful experience, but my eyes don't really work in the same way they used to. Spent way too much time staring at a screen, and I had a conversation at home, and I said to a friend of mine, what about if the only book I would ever do other than that book is a book on City Hall, but I'm never going to pitch it because the publisher might want it. and then literally like a week later, the publisher texts me and she goes, I've got a great idea. You should do a book on City Hall. I was like, oh no. It's like you got me in the total weak spot. So, that came out most recently. But
So for the record, what are you willing to commit right now that you will never do?
nothing, because I always end up doing it. Yeah.
Okay. One of the beautiful things about the documentary is that you've got Kevin Starr, who's no longer with us, and you've got some of these other, historians, and you've got Angela Lansbury, which is kind of a little bit out of left field, but you mentioned to me that was a get that was worthy of a story in and of itself, and I'd like to hear that little piece if you don't mind.
Well, when I first started researching Bullocks, Wiltshire, and somebody told me that Angela Lansbury used to work in Bullocks, Wiltshire, I kind of had that feeling where if you didn't get her in this film, there would be a gap, and you would always watch it and know that you could have had Angela Lansbury but didn't have her. So I thought, well, I got the number to her agent, and I rang up her agent's office, and they said, well, send us an email. I said, well, what's your email? And the email was like assistant number 1, or whatever the agency name was. And I thought, oh, this is not going to work. And I kept ringing them back, and it never worked. And I found out this woman that worked with her. And so I emailed her, and I never really heard back from her. And then I wrote her a letter, and then I sent her some flowers, and then I'd sent her some chocolates, and then I sent her some more flowers, and Christmas rolled around, and I sent her some more flowers. And then I found out where Angela Lansbury lived, and I sent her some flowers, and then I sent her some more flowers, and then I sent her a letter, and then I sent her this whole booklet about why she should do this interview. And this whole thing went on for a year, and it was getting really expensive, and then she finally agreed to do it, which was just blew my mind. And we went round her house, and she lives in a lovely house, but we set up all the cameras before she came out, right? So we were all ready to go by the time she comes out the back, and she comes out the back of her the back already made up. She looks wonderful, and she's like, who's who, what's what. And she sits down, and it was almost quite emotional for me, because I'd like tried so hard to get her here. And I remember sitting down, and she sat in front of me, and I just looked at her, and I said, thank you so much. This means everything to me. And she goes, I know it does. I know it does. And then I said, do you remember much about Bullock's Wilshire, working there? And she goes, no, not really. and then she just paused long enough, and went, I'm only joking. But yeah, no, she was a great interview.
And so Kevin Starr, how big a part was he in the direction that the documentary took?
Well, Kevin Starr was the first interview I did, because I realized that, in many ways he was the preeminent voice on anything California history. And, Pam Parkinson, who was one of the Parkinson great-granddaughters, wrote a letter of introduction, because I guess she'd studied at Harvard, and Kevin Starr had been at Harvard at one point. And, I hadn't made any other documentaries like this at that point, and I wasn't sure if he was going to do it. And anyway, he did it, and we set up that day, and I'd done all this research where, I kind of felt like John Parkinson really was the greatest public architect of Los Angeles at a time when the city was inventing himself. But I felt like I didn't have the confidence to say that, because at that point I hadn't written any books, I hadn't published the documentary. And I remember Kevin Starr sitting down, and I said to Kevin Starr, where does John Parkinson fit in this big picture of Los Angeles history? And Kevin Starr, kind of like sits back, and he's like, John Parkinson was the greatest public architect at a time in which Los Angeles was inventing itself. I'm like, yes. If he says it, it's true. It's true. And that changed my life, because honestly, that one sentence changed my life, because I had to go and do so many presentations on John Parkinson, often to people who wouldn't know who he was. And he'd given me the confidence to stand up and say he's the greatest public architect. And I never felt any fear about saying it, because Kevin Starr said it. And if he said it, I sign up for it, But, in some ways, when he died, I guess I thought about this a lot, because some of the things he said to me in the interview, I didn't really, his level of expertise and the way in which he processed information was so encyclopedic that it took me 6 months of watching this hour or 2 hour interview back to truly understand what he meant. I mean, superficially I could understand what he meant, but the longer I watched it back, and since then I've read many of his books, and and when you research the same subjects, you look at them and you realize that three or four sources make up one sentence. And that's when you realize the level of detail and the level of understanding and comprehension that he had, and his ability, to put that into your head and then spit it back to you in a way that's still televisually friendly, is just an incredible achievement. And I'm so glad that he was able to do it.
Right. Now, as a matter of fact, at one point in the documentary, and it's Starr that says this, and I hadn't heard that before, when he refers to what with Bullock's Wilshire, with what Starr called the California setback style. Do you have any? I hadn't heard that before.
I think he said the American setback.
American
style.
setback. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes. What does he mean? What was the difference between the American setback style and what the Parkinsons did with it, for context?
Well, I mean, the setback style was a very popular thing to have. A building surrounded by a tower, or surrounding a tower. That was very popular in the 20s. I mean, I guess the idea of what Kevin Starr's talking about, it was an adaptation in the sense that he made, there's so many Art Deco elements that are woven into the design of this building that hadn't really been woven into other buildings in the same way up until then.
Yeah, and as I'm thinking about it, so many of at least the later works that the Parkinsons, let's pluralize it. There are tower elements, whether it's City Hall or Union Station or Bullock's Wilshire or USC. There are towers as part of that.
I think yeah.
That process.
They're all defining statement pieces. I mean, I look back particularly at City Hall, and wonder, what it must have been like to grow up in City Hall when, for the most of your lifetime, the height restriction would have been 150 feet. And then, here you have a building that is 452 feet tall, 3 times the existing height limit. I mean, you look back and you see like the groundbreaking ceremony for City Hall, and there's somebody there that talks about, hunting rabbits in the area, and now you have a structure with like 9,000 tons of structural steel in it, and just, that can be seen for miles around. What that must have been like as an Angelino to grow up perhaps in the 1890s and then have a monumental skyscraper, with a beacon on it dedicated to Charles Lindbergh, the future of aviation. And what a wonderful time in some ways it must have been to have been alive in Los Angeles and really have sort of unlimited possibilities for a city.
Now, since you have done all this research on Parkinson, not only as an architect, but also as a man, as a person, I mean, you had so many wonderful bits of things that he had written. And I guess, was there a diary? Was there a biography? What was the source of some of those wonderful little voice bits that were ascribed to him?
The voice parts partly came from letters that Parkinson wrote, and partly came from a biography that Parkinson wrote, which is the most frustrating biography that I've ever read, because basically it builds up, and then it gets to Los Angeles, and then he just talks about some of the friends he had, nothing about any of the buildings that he did really. And then after that, he talks about all of his travels and where he went on holiday, and it's useful because it gives you an insight to who he was and what his motivations were. But on the flip side of it, a psychologist would have a field day about somebody that wrote a biography, but didn't want to write about the things that they were best known for. Really, they wanted to write about how they got started. It was almost, as if he was going to leave that to somebody else to do in the future, or if he thought perhaps he was worried about offending somebody, that he held back on it. But yeah.
What do you think goes on inside the mind of an architect, of an artist, like someone like Parkinson or someone else? I mean, you had, when you did the City Hall book, you actually had talked with the current some of the current architects at A.C. Martin and Company, who had also been on the City Hall project. What sort of thinking goes on in the mind of an architect that doesn't take place in anyone else's brain? I guess what I'm looking for is, where's the inspiration to look at something and say, oh, we can do that, and here's how we do it?
I mean, I think there's a lot of things going on. I mean, City Hall's design was heavily influenced by Bertram Goodhue's design for the Nebraska State Capitol building, so that's a big influence. Also, I mean, I think what was interesting when they were building City Hall is that I think the expectation was that it would probably only be the City Hall for the next sort of 30 to 50 years. So you're really at a transitional point when you're creating something that's going to make a statement. But I think how they would have looked at Los Angeles differently then is that it would have been changing so rapidly that I think you were almost expecting your work to get caught up in that change and not to last. So I think if Parkinson came back now and found that City Hall and so many of his works were still there, I think you'd be absolutely thrilled. But I think more than anything, particularly with City Hall, he was just trying to make the boldest statement possible that Los Angeles intended to have a stake in the future.
Is that a reasonable expectation, that as an architect you're creating a building with the thought that maybe I'll outlive it, maybe it won't? It's going to be knocked down, something will happen, it'll be replaced by something more modern. Is that an understanding of architecture generally?
I think most architects, if they live long enough, see some of their work knocked down. Parkinson certainly did see some office buildings, some residential structures come down within his lifetime. But to think that we still have 50 still standing, more than 400 projects done in his lifetime, I'm guessing, but I would estimate at least 300 of them are still stood.
Mm.
You know, so I mean that's an incredible legacy. But if you'll forgive me for a second, I need to point a couple of people out here tonight. We've actually got John Parkinson's great-granddaughters here, Kimberly, and John Parkinson's great-great-grandson, Arlen's here. Also, I noticed Joycey Fickett's here. Joycey Fickett's husband, Ed Fickett, designed about 60,000 houses in California. I mean, so many houses that there's probably a chance that somebody in the audience even lives in a Fickett house and doesn't know it. So,
Well, welcome. Hopefully we have a chance to maybe ask them something in the Q&A perhaps or something
Sure.
like that. We were talking earlier,
yeah,
and you had mentioned that I was commenting on the tragedy of the Parkinson men.
right.
That within a 20-year span, you had John, you had Donald, you had Donnie, all dying, and suddenly they're gone. And you had pointed out to me that there is actually one building that all three of them had their hands into. Could you elaborate on that one?
Well, I will do. But firstly,
Okay.
one of the things that I really love about the Parkinson story, and I know there's a lot of sadness in the sense that it disappears because the family connection disappears. But in some ways, they just exist for that sliver of time. And if you were an architect in the entire history of the city, and you were going to be dominant for one 20, 30, 40-year period, that was the period to do it in. More than any other period, that's the period when you come in and say, this is the city that we're going to be. And you see a lot of the projects that even in the late 30s that Donald Parkinson takes on become somewhat routine. They become, fairly standard factories. That need for a grand city hall has been taken care of. That need for a wonderful new Union Station has been taken care of.
Mm-hmm.
So these key, mega structures that define a city are gone, and the firm already starts shrinking. But this was something we figured out literally last week. We were looking at the plans for the King Edward Hotel, and we noticed in the 20s, Donald Parkinson, obviously King Edward Hotel was owned by John Parkinson. In the 20s, Donald Parkinson does a revision, and in the 50s, Donnie Parkinson, grandson, comes, and we saw his initials, DWP, and realized that 3 generations had actually worked on the King Edward Hotel, all owned by John Parkinson. So, it's a remarkable legacy.
And something else that occurred to me in the documentary is that the Coliseum, City Hall, Bullocks Wilshire, Union Station, even though they were completed, there's been a constant either not so much repurpose in a couple of cases, but revisions, additions. I mean, they're still in development.
Right.
And I have to wonder how that contrasts to the hardcore preservationists that insist that nothing be touched, nothing be changed. And I mean, I can understand their position, but at the same time, if the building is still going to be as functional as possible, doesn't it just kind of go without saying that, well, you need to make a few changes if it's going to continue to be a viable living thing?
Yeah, I mean, I have mixed feelings about that. I'm a huge fan of preserving Parkinson buildings and, any opportunity. But I mean, one of the wonderful thing about this story is that, it's like Kevin Starr said, you come back in 100 years' time, these buildings are still functional, they're still beautiful, and they're still in use. Yeah. And all of the buildings you saw today are functional, they are in use. A Parkinson designed building or for an apartment downtown is something that you'll see a realtor boast about now. Come live in this John Parkinson building, so they're not going anywhere. But I mean, I don't like them being altered. That's for sure.
Yeah. You showed a couple of things up in Seattle, but there are still a lot of the school buildings, and of course the other buildings that he built while he was there.
Right.
They're still there. They're still in use.
Yeah, the BF Day School is which you saw is the longest continually operating school in the Pacific Northwest. It's still there. The Seattle National Bank, which is really one of my favorite Parkinson buildings, because the way he decorated it is you see these almost like otherworldly figures that he packs onto the building, like gargoyles. And different faces that he puts into clouds and stuff that you don't see in any other building. And also the fact that he felt proud enough when he finished this building to go around the back of it and, put his name into it in cement, and it's still there, and it's still in use. And, the folks in Seattle do treasure his work, even though not nearly as much of it remains as here.
So I guess I'm trying to figure out what there obviously there wasn't enough time in the documentary to go as far as you wanted to, because we were talking earlier, and you had that hard 57-minute running time to get PBS and anyone else who wanted to run it, and so there were pieces that had stories that had to be left out. And one of the things that I was wondering is, you hinted about the competition between Bergeson and Parkinson.
Right.
And so could you expand on that element for me a little bit?
Well, Edmund Bergstrom, I guess, came to Parkinson because he has this letter of referral from Edwin Thiel, gets a job with Parkinson as a draftsman. In 1905, he marries into the Kimberly family, in which the Kimberly family owned the Kimberly Crest House in Redlands that some of you are probably familiar with. But it was clear almost immediately that Bergstrom had literally no intent of just sitting back and being a junior partner to John Parkinson. I mean, they don't really document this relationship, but you see almost immediately when that 10-year partnership ends that Bergstrom sets up his own business, and then he competes with through the Allied Architects Association, which Bergstrom forms, which was basically a group of local architects who came together to bid for civic projects. But Bergstrom competes almost immediately with several different projects with Parkinson as soon as he leaves. He competes with him to design the Central Library, which obviously none of them got. He competes with him to design City Hall. So I don't have any record of them interacting, but I imagine it would be a somewhat awkward connection once they got back together again.
Starr makes or someone makes the observation that Neutra, in other words, the modernist architects are the ones who, the ones that we think of today, the ones that are more closely associated than Parkinson. But I'm sure, was there any indication that those modernists looked at what Parkinson did? Did they know him? Did they work with him? Did they just look at his stuff and say, "Oh, we can do something better, something different"?
Well, the way I always think about it is that Frank Lloyd Wright had an office in the Homer Laughlin building at one point. Okay. And Frank Lloyd Wright would have bitten your hand off for the chance to design Los Angeles City Hall. He would have bitten your hand off to design Union Station, the Coliseum, Bullock's Wilshire. I don't think it's even comparable. They exist in two different worlds. Many of the modernists are created, are remembered for creating a new style. But significantly, it's a new style of residential architecture predominantly. With Parkinson isn't really remembered, but on the flip side of that, he created the structures that define the dominant metropolis on the west coast of the United States. And one of the things I always think about, is Parkinson always used to go back to Bolton, go back to visit his family. It was a big thing to visit his family. And he always used to take like whatever the latest American car was, and he'd put it on the train, ship it over to Britain, and he'd drive up the old cobble streets in the working class districts where he grew up, and he used to go and see his family. And I often wonder what it would be like if you were John Parkinson and you go back and see your buddies and you drive up the street in this, latest American car with all the kids up the street following you, and you go and sit in the pub and you're like, well, hey, Bob, how's life been treating you? What have you been up to? And, Bob's like, oh, I'm still working in the factory down the road. Hey, John, what are you doing? Oh, well, I designed the majority of iconic structures in the west coast of the United States. I mean, I don't think you could have got your head around it. In some ways, that sort of Lancashire upbringing that everything had to be very unpretentious must have kept him going through that. But I think you'd go back to England and I don't know what you would say to people. I don't know how you would even fathom an idea of how you would translate that level of success.
And is it fair to say that Parkinson could not start today with the skill set that he had, back in the 1880s? Because nowadays, to be an architect, there is so much more technical skill that you would have to master. It seems to me that could you even call yourself an architect based on what he had?
I mean, you have to remember that Parkinson really had no formal education as an architect. Everything that he knew about architecture, predominantly, he even learned from being a builder's apprentice, a little bit from doing evening classes, but most of it he learned in the library, which is why this building is so wonderful. But, there's absolutely no way that a figure like him could exist today. But I think if you were to take this story to the highest level and say, what does this story signify beyond all other things? And I think the thing that it signifies is that, to me, it's really like a reminder, like an example of what you can do in one lifetime if you are prepared to educate yourself. And it doesn't need to be architecture, but if you had something that you were so passionate about, even with a lack of resources and were determined to be good at it, whatever it took, you could do it. So technically, you'd still have to get a qualification, but the idea that you can educate yourself, it shouldn't be forgotten, even though there's all these qualification obstacles to getting there.
And we talked briefly about his house in Santa Monica. Is that one of the few residential? First of all, did he design that himself?
Yeah, I mean, John Parkinson, I guess in around 1913, went out to Santa Monica and bought a ranch with about 114 acres on it for not a lot of money. One of the things that gets really frustrating when you read about this historical figures, Parkinson had a ranch in Malibu with 800 acres at one point, and he gets really frustrated because nobody will buy it because they all say, what are we going to do with it? It's too much land, and you look back now and see the plan, the area where he built his own house, which would have been really, undeveloped in 1913. And you look at the later maps and see where it's subdivided, and your head just starts exploding because you start thinking, you could buy a small country for what you get 100 acres in Santa Monica for today. So, no, but he absolutely designed his house himself. His wife, Meta, was still alive when he started working on it, and that was his escape from the city. He would commute into downtown, go back there every night and have these incredible views. But one of the wonderful thing about his house is that he dies in 35. His wife Florence, who you saw in the film, dies in 66. In 66, his house was sold through an auction to a woman called Drew Alfson. Drew Alfson lived till, I think, last year. So in the time that she lived in that house till about last year, she changed the staircase, right? She moved the light fixture in the hallway into the kitchen. And she built some stuff outside You know, she built a pool and tennis courts and stuff. But in terms of the actual main house, that staircase, moving that light, was pretty much all she did. You know, to the point that if you went to Woodacres, his house in Santa Monica, there's photographs of John Parkinson in the 1920s, you know, sitting out on a Sunday afternoon in his full three-piece suit and his tie, because this guy, no matter how hot it was, would never relax into something else. He was always entirely formal. But you see in front of the house, stood in front of flower pots that are still there. You know, and so his house is currently for sale. And if we have any preservation-minded folks in the audience that have $20 million and want to go and buy that house in Santa Monica, I'd love to come and visit it. So please invite me. But you know, yeah, sure. It's a time capsule. You know, I mean, you walk in there and you can feel, you know, what it was like for him to be there. I mean, you know, his driveway up to his house, you know, is now an entire street. You know, so there's about 20 houses on, or whatever it is, on his driveway. You know, put it all the way around him. But yeah, I mean, what a time to have lived in Los Angeles when you could have gone down to Santa Monica and bought yourself a huge plot of land and done whatever you wanted.
Yeah, I think we'll be ready for some questions from you folks in a minute, as soon as we get a floor mic going. So if you had to sum Parkinson up, you know, in a sentence or two, which I know is extremely difficult considering how much time you've spent, 10 years or so on this project. Right. What would you say? How could you sum it up that that short?
No, I mean, obviously he's determined, he's motivated, he's unpretentious, but he's also guided by this principle that you don't cheat anybody. You know, good work, as he wrote in his letter to his son in 1926, good work is more important than good profits. You know, that's, I mean, think about that. You know, his son's in the firm, 1926, the son's really starting to dominate the business. JP's starting to step back, his son's coming forward, and dad says, good work before good profits. And good business, you know, must be profitable to exist. You shouldn't fund it yourself, but you should do good work. That's more important than anything else. So I think you know, I never came across any instance of anybody feeling like they'd been cheated by John Parkinson.
Wow, that's impressive. Okay, we have time for questions. We do have a microphone if you want to raise your hands. Okay, right over there.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank you for bringing to John Parkinson the attention that he so richly deserves.
Thank you.
And secondly, two comments. One is that I look around the room and I think there are enough people here who are old enough to remember growing up in Los Angeles when City Hall was the tallest building in Los Angeles. And you drove into Los Angeles and what you were looking for on the horizon was who could see City Hall first.
Yeah.
And the second comment is my grandmother worked in Berlitz, Wilshire in the late 30s and early 1940s, so that's an important building to me. But the question I have, the thing that strikes me about his work over 50 years is that as architectural styles changed, he stayed on the cutting edge of that through so many eras. And what was the inspiration for him to do that? What was he like that he could do that?
Well, I think, I mean, primarily, I mean, he studies all of the architectural journals, so he knows the trends that are going on. But I think what's significant about this story and why it's so lasting is because, you know, in this time period where, you know, John Parkinson's getting into his late 50s, into his 60s, where you think he would be slightly beginning to slow down. He's sort of fully established himself in the city. And then suddenly you get this lightning bolt of his son coming in, you know, has been educated in Paris and Rome and has this wonderful artistic lifestyle, mixes with all these artists and movie stars, and has all this incredible wealth that John Parkinson never had. You know, Donald Parkinson was celebrated as an artist, but comes in and reinvigorates his firm, almost like gives it a lightning bolt right at the time when it was potentially about to fizzle. So in some ways, you know, it's the perfect arc, because John Parkinson studies the journals, keeps up on the latest trends, follows them, tries to develop new things, always. I mean, also, you saw in the film, Parkinson is not just an architect, he's an innovator. So bringing the latest fireproof technology, bringing the latest elevator technology, bringing the latest steel tame technology is something that he particularly prides himself on. You know, he wants the building, a Parkinson building, to have the latest of everything. But also significantly, he wants a building that's classy. You know, it doesn't take that style, the latest style, and overpower you with it. It's not like, you know, a new trend would come along and John Parkinson would really like shove it in your face. He would find some elegant way of displaying it. But, you know, I don't think that desire to be at the top of your game or to be ahead of trends is probably, you know, psychologists might say, well, if you don't have a formal education and you're competing with people in a city with people that have formal educations and would be expected to stay up to latest architectural trends, you should too. So I think it's a number of different factors, but that was certainly something that was very important to him.
I have the mic.
Yes, ma'am.
The question I have for you has to do with not the obvious buildings that we know, but of the other buildings that may not be as well known. Can you get into them? Is there a list of the ones you can go and explore?
I have a list.
I would like that list.
I don't know if a published list. I think one of the things that I love about this story is that once you realize what is and isn't a Parkinson building, and you live in Los Angeles, you'll look at one most days. You know, I mean, I had to meet somebody once on the corner of 4th and Spring Street, and I was waiting for them, and I did like a 360-degree turn, not in a ballerina way, just a very sort of slow turn round, and I could count 14 pieces of 14 different Parkinson buildings that I could see from that single intersection. So I think once you get used to the idea of what a Parkinson building is and what it looks like, you just never stop seeing them.
But can we get into them? And
well, it depends which ones you're interested in getting into. But you know, I always had this thing where I really wanted to see inside the stock exchange building that Parkinson did with Samuel London, and I was walking down Spring Street once with a guy I used to work with, and so we went into the Spring Street building just because the door was open. And I can't tell you how many times I've done this just because the door was open. And the guy I was with got a phone call, and the cell phone's reception was terrible. So he suddenly started shouting, "Hello, hello!" I'm like, "Oh no, we're right inside the building. We're going to get caught." But I don't know. There's so many of them that I've just walked into.
So is there a way that you could provide interested people? Because I don't mind knocking on the door and walking in, but I'd like to see what they look like.
I could send you a list for sure.
Okay, appreciate it very much. Thank
Yeah.
you.
All right. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm, is it on?
Yep.
Yeah.
I represent the Union Station Historical Society.
Yeah.
And in answer to one of your questions, and I'll give you one in turn, the station works because he planned ahead. There have been numerous suggestions by Metro to build all kinds of things into Union Station. And always the reason is so it would improve the number of people that it can handle. But there are in fact hidden passageways that are there by the architect and hidden, literally, so this way it can be expanded and used. So the reason I think so many of the Parkinson buildings are around is because he planned for the future.
Yeah.
Now, I'll tell you, I'd like to ask you a question. Is there a signature at Union Station? Because I've looked all over it and I haven't found it, but I haven't
Well, no, but there wouldn't be for John Parkinson, because Parkinson's dead 35, and then it opens in 39. So I'm not aware one. If you found one, I would love to see.
I was certain. By the way, did you know there's a quarter scale model of Union Station in Culver City
Where's that
that
hiding?
is used, latest use as the Sammy's Cameras store. It was built by a fellow who was a model railway buff, and he's retired and he sold the building, but he purposely designed it to look exactly like Union Station. It's on Sepulveda Boulevard. It's all there.
It's interesting because they just found the original model that Parkinson considered commissioned for Bullock's Wilshire, and they found. I guess it was stuffed in sub-cabinet, with all cigarette ends and damaged at Bullock's Wilshire, and somebody's just come up with the like a donation to restore it. So I guess next time if you do a tour of Bullock's Wilshire, they'll have it on display. But it's pretty cool.
Okay. Are there any other questions? We've got one over here. Okay. Yeah, it'll be a note.
Hi, that actually plays into the question I was going to ask, which is when you went to you went to Bullock's, you went to Union Station, you went to the buildings. What are their archives like? Have they retained the original designs and correspondence or anything, or did you have to run all over the place to try to track stuff down, or have they
No.
have they kept hold of their of the generated materials?
Well, I guess during in the whole lifetime of the Parkinson firm, and by that I say, after Donald Parkinson dies in 45, the Parkinson firm still has the name in it, but some other folks who'd been working at the firm, got their name on the door. It gets taken over. So all the way through to the 70s, there is some variation, or late 80s, early 90s. There's some variation of the Parkinson firm with the architectural drawings that still exist, and that firm basically in the Parkinson archive of projects that still exist in one place, there is about 700 plans that all exist, and Union Station is one of the rare exceptions because that predominantly went to the Getty Museum. USC took a little bit of it, not all of it. They have some of the correspondence and some other documentation that go along with it. But Bullock's Wilshire, they have some stuff. They have a lot of scrapbooks, I would call them, that are quite interesting. Some letters, not a lot of it, but most of Parkinson's designs had existed in that what I would now call the Parkinson archive, that was owned by a guy who ended up taking it to Texas because he ended up moving to Texas, and it's been in a storage unit in Galveston for about 25 years, and we're trying to get it back to LA, and we're in the process of working on that right now. So, but it is remarkable, and I guess what will differentiate Parkinson in the future is that so much of what he worked on still exists. The plans still exist. So plans for like the 1896 Courier building still exist. The Brayley block, even though it's well over 100 years ago, still exists. In fact, one of the things that really made me kind of I don't even know how to describe this, but recently I read an article where they talked about the renovation of the Colosseum and how complicated it had been because all of the plans no longer exist. I know they're all sat in a box. So yeah, so they all still exist. So I mean, other than Union Station that went to the Getty USC, City Hall that was kind of split between the Parkinson archive and the city kept some of it. Most of it's still there, and it's still a usable resource. Well, we have the city archivist.
No. No, not that I know of. Not that I know of.
But see, this is one of the interesting things about LA, and is that LA develops at such a rapid rate that I think when they put up City Hall, for example, I don't think they were thinking about keeping plans or thinking about historians coming along 80, 90 years from now and what they're going to do. I mean, when I was researching the book on City Hall, one of the terrible things that I heard was that this story about, you know, back in the 60s or something, that this electrician had been going home one night and he walks out past City Hall and he sees like this giant skip, like a trash bin, right? And he sees all these plans sticking out of the trash bin. So the electrician goes to the trash bin and goes, oh, look, it's the plans for City Hall. And so he goes in there and he picks out all the electrical plans and leaves all the rest in there. But fortunately, somebody made some copies, and I found some copies in the basement of the Board of Public Works. And the only reason I found them is because somebody had suggested I look in there when I did a book on this building and try and find the plans. And I rang up the Board of Public Works, and this guy rings me back and he's like, yeah, I'm sure I saw those plans hanging out of a drawer somewhere. And we went down in the basement, and sure enough, they were hanging out the drawer. There was no sign on the door that said City Hall plans. And they just existed in this drawer because this one guy who is now retired actually knew where they were. So I think, you know, and until the last few decades when these guys came along and started organizing stuff, and you can speak better than this than I ever could, LA never really got its head around saving stuff and organizing it in the way that perhaps it could have done.
Yeah, that's a conversation for a whole another time. I think we've got time for one more.
Thanks again for being here. Thanks for the documentary and all your books. They're all just great.
Thank you.
Question I had regards the library itself. I think I remember in one of your books you had mentioned that when the project went to Bertram Goodhue, that Parkinson sued because he didn't get the job. And I was wondering, how did that play out?
Well, I think it was more of a threat than an actual legal action. But yeah, I mean, with the library, you had the same team of what they called the associate architects, which is Parkinson, John C. Austin, and Albert C. Martin. You know, came together to bid for this building, and I think there was a lot of folks at the time that just expected that it was almost a formality that they would get it. But you know, but the problem is that you have a city librarian that, like all librarians, is well read and understands trends, or thinks they do, you know, and has a certain level of artistic snobbery, I guess, but also on another level realizes that if you want to create an artistic statement, if you want a building, you know, that's considered in a city that's not really considered of national significance in the same way that it is now, if you want a building of national significance, go out and get an architect of national significance. And you know, he somewhat doggedly refused to give up on that pursuit of Bertram Goodhue, even though the mayor, you know, and a lot of the heads of like the Chamber of Commerce and other departments are saying, come on, seriously, this is our dream team of LA architects. You know, Parkinson, Austin, and Martin, you know, really are the dream team. You know, how can we not give it to it? And I think the fact that they didn't get this building in some ways made it more likely that they would get City Hall, because I think there was a sense amongst civic leaders that, and this is a really bizarre argument to have in a city that, you know, is made up of such diverse population, but Bertram Goodhue was an outsider. He was a New Yorker compared to two Englishmen and a guy from Chicago, Illinois. Bertram Goodhue's an outsider, and I think once you get to City Hall, they were like, no, we're not going to let that happen again. And predominantly, you know, in the run-up to building City Hall, it's all local architects, local-based architects that are competing for the project. Even, you know, fairly late in the game when Schultz and Weaver, who do the Biltmore Hotel, trying to get in on the action, it's not really considered. You know, City Hall was designed by those three guys in reaction, I think, to what happened here.
Okay, and I guess that's probably a good spot to leave us. one more time. Never say never to another project.
No, I mean, I've lived the last 10, 12 years of my life wrapped up in something. To me, I've loved every single second of this story. You know, during this process, during the 80s, one of the Parkinson relatives said that a box of stuff that belonged to John Parkinson had gone missing. And they told me about some of the stuff that was in it, and I spent the whole process of doing the book feeling devastated that I didn't have this box. And then one day, I got a text from one of the relatives that was moving out of the house and said, "Hey, we found this box." And they said in this box, you know, this box had letters from Herbert Hoover, Henry Ford. It had that picture of John Parkinson with the other three architects at City Hall, the picture of John Parkinson with the elevator concept, and I had a giant scrapbook that said John Parkinson's scrapbook printed on it. And I remember I went to Boston where all these boxes were, and I spent 3 days looking at this stuff. And then, I mean, every second of my time was looking at this stuff. And when I left, I just felt so down because I realized that when you spend so much time researching something, when you're so absorbed and your life is taken over by something, and then somebody says to you, "Here's the Holy Grail." You can only have that experience so many times in your life. You know, and I know it's a bunch of papers. I know it's a bunch of old photographs. But for me, it was magic. I spent 3 days like, oh my God, look at that. It really exists. Three days of that. And I left that weekend, come back, and I'm like, that'll never happen again. I'll never have those 3D.
Well, I hope you're wrong on that one. I hope it comes back again and again, you know, and whatever you do next.
But so one last thing on Angela Lansbury.
Yeah.
So I know it's a bit random, but you asked me about things I couldn't squeeze in the film. Yeah. She's the bonus on the DVD that you can get in the library store today only. 15 minutes of Angela Lansbury talking about Bullock's Wilshire, why her mother was fired from the store from spending too much time showing the kids how to play the games and then playing with them. Those kind of things.
Okay.
So, but you know, I appreciate you being here, and I appreciate you watching it, and it's been a privilege. So thank you.
Stephen, this has been so much fun. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.